Gentlemen, could you please give the warmest of welcomes to a great Conservative, Dan Hannan.
Thank you for those very generous words. And ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be back. I took my first faltering steps in politics as a member of the Bruges Group. I think I joined this organisation in 1990, when it was new. Patrick Robertson was the secretary, Lord Harris of High Cross was the chairman, and Euroscepticism wasn't really a thing yet. The Bruges Group was, if you like, the beginning of what became the movement that led to what we now call Brexit, although nobody was to invent that word for another couple of decades. I do indeed remember I was as an undergraduate, I set up the Oxford Campaign for an Independent Britain. And I remember reading, when the Maastricht Treaty vote happened, that there were only 4 of the new intake MPs who'd been brave enough to vote against. And I read this story about how the Whips were all being very rude and bullying towards them, and even, and at the age of 18 even, this struck me as unfair, even phoning their wives and saying, you know, they've made a terrible mistake. Can you talk? I thought this was so outrageous, so we did a whip round. And we indeed sent flowers to Mrs. Barry Legg and the other 3, who in memory served were Mrs. Walter Sweeney, Mrs. Ian Duncan Smith, and Mrs. Bernard Jenkin, I think, before 92 intake who voted against. But you know, it's a really striking thing to look at how the argument has evolved since then. Bruges Group took its inspiration from Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech, which is almost exactly 35 years old. So, late September of 1988. And the striking thing when you look at her speech at the College of Europe is how almost banal it is in its very gentle and constructive criticisms of extreme federalism. It's difficult to imagine why anyone would now react to it in the way that the leaders of the EU did in those days, which was explosive, as though expunging some terrible heresy. And it's worth just thinking about this. People say, you know, what was it? I was always being asked in Brussels, what is it you've got against the EU? When did you change your minds about it? Why did you go from voting 2-1 to stay in 1975? And I'd say, well, look, there's more to it than just one thing, but if you want the single biggest reason, it was the Maastricht Treaty. Up until that moment, you could still plausibly claim that the European Economic Community, as it still was until 1992, was primarily about trade and economics. It was a club of countries getting together to do what they couldn't achieve singly, to collaborate and magnify their collective power. But after Maastricht, it was very clear that we were on a road towards political union. From then on, it was, for Britain, a question of could we opt out of it, or would we have to leave the whole European Union? For what it's worth, I suspect that even as late as February 2016, if David Cameron had come back with any significant retrieval of power, had it been in just one area, had he come back with a repatriation of power in, let's say, fisheries or industrial policy or whatever, that would have been enough because he'd have established the precedent. The power didn't always get sucked into the centre, that it could move up or down. Who can doubt in that situation that Britain would have stayed in the European Union? And I mention this only because it's something that is almost never raised. When I speak to friends, we must all have friends who voted Remain and who regret it. When I speak to them, one of the things that they never seem to do is interrogate the EU's role, either before or after the referendum. I'm struck again and again by the way in which the Remain and Rejoin movement is strikingly uninterested in what's happening in the EU. It seems to be much more motivated by dislike of Euroscepticism than by any real loyalty to Brussels. Certainly, this was replicated in the EU itself. So you remember how we kept on deferring Brexit. It was pretty awkward for me as an EP. I would And if you've ever had that experience where you say goodbye to somebody in a really long, involved way, and then you find that you're both walking in exactly the same direction, that was my life for years after the Brexit vote, because we kept on setting a date for Brexit, and I, make sure that my wonderful Spanish staffers had jobs to go on to in Brussels, and I'd say goodbye to everyone, would have a farewell dinner, and then with sort of crashing Mayples, I find myself creeping back the next week. And this happened 4 times, I think, that the Brexit date was postponed. Even my German colleagues, who are not usually the first to see the funny side, even they were beginning to display a little twitch around their neck. But anyway, that taught me a lot about how the EU saw Brexit, because I was still there for fully 4 years afterwards. And listening to the comments of my friends and colleagues, I thought that there were basically, almost all of them, in fact, there were 3, if you like, acceptable responses to the Brexit. One was disbelief. You're never actually going to leave. Denial, whatever you want to call it. One was rage. Working class oafs led astray by unscrupulous demagogues and foreign newspaper owners. And one was a kind of vindictive contempt. Yeah, okay, leave and then see what happens. Right? But one thing that was absolutely unacceptable, one thing I never heard from anyone was, I wonder why they voted leave. I wonder whether we might have played that victim. I wonder whether anyone else might vote leave if they were given a referendum in another country. The EU missed its great opportunity to interrogate its own policies, to ask whether there was a problem with the remoteness of its policy, the attitudes of its officials, and the speed with which it had been agglomerating power. Instead, as we just heard from Professor Condon, it's pushed ahead with more integration, especially in the fields of taxation and military capacity. So, Brexit, it seems to me, if we ask this, if you put it like this, why was the EU not prepared to make any concession to David Cameron? Why was it not prepared to allow any power to be devolved? Why was it readier to lose its second largest member than to allow the precedent that some powers might be devolved? Well, the answer is because for the people running the EU, devolving power, ending the one-way street, reversing the ratchet, would have been the worst possible outcome, right? And that, in the end, I think, is what made Brexit inescapable. And so thank you to everyone involved in this organisation for having the courage to stand out against all of the official prognostications of doom, which, I have to say, have spectacularly failed to materialise. And it is worth taking a moment, because a casual reader of our headlines, and particularly a casual reader of the headlines of some European and American media, would think that our economy has been an absolute disaster and that Brexit has failed on every level. Actually, what we were told, not just by the Remain campaign, which is fair enough, but by the Treasury and the Bank of England and the IMF and the OECD, all of the predictions we were given for an immediate recession, rise in unemployment, collapse in house prices, fall of the stock exchange, all of those things turned out to be the opposite. I can spend the rest of today's session just talking about economic data, but let me just give you the bottom line. Whether you count from the referendum, or whether you count from the date on which Brexit took effect, Britain has grown faster than the EU. That seems to me an open and shut case against the catastrophism that so many still think was experienced, right? The disaster that so many still insist, in fact, took place. Now, I can't prove that if we'd stayed in the EU we wouldn't have grown even faster. Of course, no one can prove a negative. It's a counterfactual. But I think that was not the claim. The claim was that by voting leave, we were condemning ourselves to some kind of civilizational collapse. Well, we have grown faster than France and Germany and Spain, and so on. That is not to say that we've made all the decisions that have come since White. EU lifted constraints, allowed us to make, Brexit removed constraints, allowed us to make different decisions. I think we have failed to take advantage of some of the opportunities that have opened up. But I think it is fundamentally dishonest to have this deliberate conflation that we've had from so many pundits of Brexit and the cost of the lockdown. One of those cosmic coincidences was that the day that Brexit took effect, in January 2020, was the first day that 2 coronavirus victims were found in York. And those two things have been mischievously and deliberately conflated ever since. Yes, we are much poorer as a result of telling people to stay home for 2 years, better part of 2 years. How could we not be? So is almost every other country in the world. But if you wanted to argue that Brexit had made us poorer on top of that, you'd need to show that we had fared worse than other countries in a comparable situation. Now, actually, until a few weeks ago, it did slightly look on some data as though you could have made that claim, at least sustained it in some cases, but the ONS's spectacular revision of our GDP figures for 2020 have made that a nonsense. And by the way, there is something rather delicious, because if you're one of those Remainers who spent the last 2 years saying the only reason that we have fallen in GDP is because of Brexit, then presumably, by your own logic, now that the figures have been upgraded, if that really was the only factor, then by your own logic, Brexit must have been a success. Right? There could be no other explanation for our having outperformed Germany and France and so on. Anyway, you did the right thing, but I do want to talk about what's actually on the on the flyers, because can the Conservatives win? That question again cannot be done from what we went through in response to the pandemic. If you pay people to stay home for the better part of 2 years, and you print money to cover the difference, you're not just going to be a lot poorer as a country. You're not just going to lose, as we did, the better part of £500 billion. You're going to change attitudes. Some people are going to become habituated to happiness. The culture of the country will be different coming out of it. The pandemic on its own was bound to make people a little bit more introverted, a little bit more wary, a little bit more authoritarian. This is what all collective threats or perceived collective threats do. It's a phenomenon well observed by behavioral psychologists. When you have a natural disaster of any kind, an earthquake, plague, volcano eruption, people become more demanding of the smack of firm government and more intolerant of any kind of dissent. And the reality of COVID and the lockdown was no different. If you look at the change in attitudes between 2019 and now on questions like should the government set prices? Should the government fix rates? Should we nationalise rail, water, whatever? You see a huge swing in a statist direction, which I think, looking at the timeline, could only be a response to the lockdown, to people being habituated for all those months to having to ask permission before they could travel, use their own property. We've become, in common with other countries, a much more statist people than we were. Only precedent I can think of that is comparable is what happened after 1940, when, again, the experience of mobilization and conscription created a demand for government which meant that the powers seized by the state on a supposedly contingent basis in 1940 were not returned after 1945. We carried on with rationing and conscription, and indeed, we carried on with the economic settlement brought in on a supposedly emergency basis to beat Hitler up until the Thatcher reforms, exchange controls and so on. So I'm afraid that when we're looking at the question, can Conservatives win? Any free marketeer in any democracy is struggling against a statist movement, a leftist cultural moment occasioned by the experience that you went through. Now, within those constraints, I think that we are actually we're doing a lot better. If we had this meeting a couple of weeks ago, I would have been struggling to point to any signs of optimism. But as Barry said in his introduction, a number of things are now palpably improving. And I just want to run through what a couple of them are, starting with the ones that Barry mentioned. So, it was extraordinary that we were proposing to push ahead with more or less arbitrary green targets, plucked out of the air, in a way that was designed to send a signal, rather than based on any proportionate cost-benefit analysis of what was afforded. I think that the correct thing for a Conservative government is to pursue climate change policies in a way that is proportionate and affordable, rather than in the millenarian Thunbergite spirit that if you deviate in any jot or tittle from our arbitrary targets, you're burning the world. Right? I think Rishi Sunak has got that exactly right. On HS2, look, the moment, let's be honest about this, the moment at which we could have got a decent amount of money back by cancelling the whole thing, passed, the last moment passed under Boris Johnson. We're now locked in to a number of contracts, which means that we're going to spend the same amount whether or not we get the railway. We can't get back any significant sums of money from the main part of the line. By the way, it's an almost perfect example of how political cowardice distorts wise policy. It was obvious 10 years ago that this project was going massively over budget. It was, in fact, it was obvious at least by 2012. A project that had been sold as 15 million was already then going to be 100 billion. Every time it came up for review, in retrospect, the correct thing would be for the Minister of the Day to say, you know what, let's cut our losses. Every time it came up for review, the relevant minister took the politically expedient decision, the more cowardly decision of saying, let's throw good money after bad, rather than risk precisely the headlines that Rishi Sunak has now attracted in some parts of the country who think they're not going to be hooked up to the line. Now, look, don't get me wrong, if there was some way of getting this train by waving a magic wand for nothing, I would do it, right? I know I can see my friends the Straffords over there who live quite close to where the line is going to be. I know that there are some people who didn't want it at all, for any price because it was going to ruin the country. That is not my position. My position was purely based on the cost of the thing. And at least we've now got a government trying to restore some basic Conservative housekeeping principles. Restore some order and sanity to our public finances by trimming the bits where we can still realistically get some money back. It's not ideal, but given the hand that he had to play, it's the best I think Rishi Sunak could have done. We've got the announcement today about cracking down on the massive expansion of working age people who are on some kind of sickness or incapacity benefits. So again, always very politically dangerous to do this. Never popular. It always looks like the rich attacking the poor. But something has gone badly wrong when the number of people of working age not working has risen to 5.4 million, up by nearly 2 million in the last 5 years, at a time when we are still importing hundreds of thousands of eager workers who are walking straight into jobs, and when we have massive labour shortages across the country. Fraser Nelson, one writer who's been really properly pursuing this story, recently wrote about how in this city, 18% of people in Manchester are out of, working age people are out of work when there are 40,000 job vacancies in Manchester, some of them extremely well paid. So again, something has gone badly wrong. Now, it may be, I'm not saying that everyone on one of these benefits is work shy. I think there is genuinely a rise in some mental health conditions, triggered not by COVID, but by lockdown. What we're seeing is not long COVID, but long lockdown. If you tell people for 2 years, do not set foot outside your house because there's a terrible, frightening virus out there, you are bound to increase the number of people who have depression and anxiety. But for most people suffering from those conditions, the best thing that can happen is that they get back into the workplace, socialised, with purpose, working with other people. And so, again, there'll be sob stories on the BBC, and I'm sure Holly Toynbee will write pieces about hard cases and so on, but it is a moral as well as an economic necessity to ensure that people have those productive lives. What else have we been doing? We're talking finally about the possibility of tax cuts. And by the way, this has to happen before the election. I don't think anyone's going to take anything on trust anymore. But I am very encouraged by the readiness to make, if you like, unpopular tax cuts, or at least tax cuts that are not the obvious populist ones, if that is the way to stimulate growth. So the conversation has been about whether we trim or remove completely the inheritance tax on it. Again, the case against that, in terms of perception, writes itself. Only 4%, all the estates are affected, the Tories are helping the rich again. And yet I can't help looking around the world. Expert on monetary policy will back me up on this, I'm sure. I can't help looking around the world and seeing that the countries that have abolished taxes on savings and inheritance are the ones that have grown fastest. The Singapores, the Australians, and the Indians. Because not only does it mean greater growth in the long term, it very often means greater prosperity in the short term. If you are a plutocrat and you are at the moment taking expensive short-term steps with expensive accountants to not pay the same inheritance, you're also incidentally not paying a bunch of other taxes. Take away the fear of the inheritance tax liability, and a lot of those people would not pay the high upfront fees for the expensive accountants and would then end up paying lots of taxes in other regards. It's a really basic principle that everyone seems to have forgotten, that if you do it in a wise and judicious way, you can cut tax rates and increase tax revenues. Put all of these things together and I think you can discern a conservative approach. By the way, we also, I think, should give this government rather more credit than it's getting for not caving into these unreasonable public sector pay demands. Not least from the railmen, who hugely inconvenienced me, and I suspect a lot of you, by doing what they always do, which is to target their strikes around the Conservative Party conference. Rishi Sunak inherited his position of having to subsidise people's fuel bills, but he has not extended it to subsidising people's mortgages. Now, all of this, you might say, well, it's too little, too late, it's only a scratch, but listen to the tone of the public debate. There is an almost universal demand for more government intervention in everything. To have done what it is doing, which is to make some savings and to keep the high ground of being moderate and sensible in doing it, make the other side sound like the extremes. That is no small achievement. So, just frankly, I suppose, I suspect a lot of you in this audience are sceptical of this behavior. Just ask the question, why is he getting so little credit for the good things he's done on reducing regulation, reducing taxes, or going easier on some of these green plans? It's a really odd thing, isn't it? I mean, on almost any measure, Rishi Sunak is a more conventional Conservative than Boris was. Certainly on public spending, the issue that fundamentally drove him to resign as Chancellor, he was fed up with signing all the checks for unwarranted spending increases. On immigration, Boris used to boast about how he'd given proposed amnesty when he was Mayor of London. Rishi was always more hardline. Obviously on these green issues. Why does he get so little credit from people who you think would agree with those things? It's an interesting question, and the only answer I've been able to come up is that we live in an age when the vibes trump the policy. I was very struck by this during the leadership contest last summer between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. I voted for Boris as leader in the first place. I didn't think he should have resigned. I believed he had a largeness of character and a generosity of soul that would appeal to the electorate, and I don't resile from that. But I never thought for a moment that the guy was any kind of fiscal conservative. He boasted about being a Brexiteer, and he meant it. When it then came to Liz versus Rishi, there was curiosities that I reckon 80% of the leavers among our party members voted for the candidate who had backed Remain. And about 80% of the Remainers voted for the candidate who had backed Remain. And by the way, I backed him consistent. Rishi wasn't wavering until the last minute in the way that Boris was. He'd been writing Eurosceptic articles when he was still at school. So why does he struggle to convey that side of his personality to the people who you'd think would be the most attuned to hear it. And I think it just comes down to looks and impressions, to what we old Brussels hands like pretentiously call gestalt. It's the way it's the taste of the guy. In very blunt terms, during that summer contest, Liz Truss looked and sounded like a Eurosceptic. You know, she said blunt things in a provincial accent and annoyed all the right people. Whereas Rishi looked and sounded like the CEO of a big multinational with his hair, his thin ties and his tight suits and so on. It's amazing how people make their tribal identifications on the basis of these quite superficial indicators and then reverse engineer the politics and convince themselves that their candidate really agrees with them. So actually, if you look at the black and white of the policy, it is really very good to portray Rishi Sunak in a way that he almost always is at meetings like this as some kind of, conservative in name only, some sort of anti-waste lib dem Davos man. He has been the first candidate, so the first Prime Minister since the Brexit vote actually to try and rein back the growth of the state. Admittedly, as I say, he's swimming against the current culturally. But by heaven, how nice to see someone at least having a go, at least trying to restore order and sanity to our public finances. Can the Conservatives win? Look, a fifth term is a big ask. It's never happened before. It last happened between 1807 and 1830. That's never happened in a democratic age. One like successive general elections. So it is a big ask. It is a big ask. But I would just urge you, and I want to leave a bit of time for questions, I would just urge you to think of this. Saying, all a bunch of shysters, I'm going to sit home, can't be any worse. You really think it can't be any worse? Use your imagination a little bit. All of the problems that we have, excessive spending, excessive taxation, excessive borrowing, are going to be exacerbated under a Labour government. That isn't speculation, that's them talking about what they want to do. The culture wars are going to have the full backing of government. It won't be rogue civil servants signing up to Stonewall to the horror of their ministers. This will be the entire establishment of politicians, officials, academics, charity heads, all pushing their identity politics at huge public expense. But I just want to leave you with this thought that it's tempting to say to ourselves, well, how much damage could Starmer do in one term? He'd take over, and then he'd have the same constraints on economic policy that any government would have. We're still spending way more than we're raising in taxes. There'll be some kind of sterling crisis. He'll be swept away, and then we can come back in a different form. Don't underestimate the fundamental wiliness of Labour when it comes to rigging the rules to make sure that they stay. And I think there are two particular things that they are speaking about quite openly, one of which they've now adopted formally as their policy. First, to give the vote to 16-year-olds. Now, the blatancy of that move is just so shocking that it leaves critics not knowing where to start. Labour, both when they were in office and now in opposition, have backed the raising of the age of consent to 18 for everything. For everything. Right? You now have to be 18 rather than 16 to get a tattoo, to get a mortgage, to buy a bottle of wine, to buy a knife, to get Botox treatment, and yet to buy cigarettes, and yet Labour is seriously saying 16-year-olds whom we have prevented by law from doing all of those things are mature enough to decide whether anyone else should get to do it. There is something just so flagrant about that. It's straightforward gerrymandering. And then the other thing, which is in a way even more outrageous, is this idea of giving the vote to EU nationals. Why? First of all, why? What is the difference in our law now between a Portuguese national and a Panamanian national? We're not in the EU. What is special about the EU? EU countries do not give each other's nationals the vote in general elections. So we'd be doing something that we didn't do as a member and that other members do not do vis-a-vis each other. Again, why? Because there is a calculation that resentment of Brexit would bring in another couple of million voters to the Labour Party, and I suspect that they're doing that because they thought it through and they've done the polling. So please do not make the mistake of thinking, well, we can afford to sit it out and we'll be back, possibly with a different set of policies, different set of personnel or whatever. That isn't how politics work. If there's one thing I've really learned in the time that I've been involved is that there is such a thing as trying to be too clever in politics. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, I'd like to leave a bit of time for discussion, but I do think that if this group, after all its successes, having stood out against all the bullying and all the lies and all the pressure from every party, every business, every international leader, having secured Brexit, if we now take our foot off the pedal and say, well, it doesn't much matter, job done, it doesn't matter who now takes over, then, in truth, all of the opportunities will be squandered. We have a leader of the opposition who quite frankly says we're going to sign up to as many of these policies from the outside as we can. It seems to me a bizarre situation where you say we'd stay outside the whole thing, but we would then unilaterally shadow and copy all of the policies. That really is a position that nobody would have. Let's try to stop that from happening. Let's keep alive the possibility of this country raising its eyes to more distant horizons and seizing